Hey everybody, welcome to another edition of American Rambler. I'm your host, Colin Woodward. Thank you for listening to the podcast. On today's show, I have John Lingan. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. We went over it a few times. He is a writer living up in Maryland. I recently read his book, Homeplace, A Southern Town, a Country Legend in the Last Days of Mountaintop Honky Tonk. It is his first book. It combines a bunch of things. It's kind of a biography of Patsy Cline and other people that we meet in Winchester, Virginia, which is a few hours north of here, near the West Virginia line. But it is fairly close to where John lives, so he decided to write about that. And we're going to talk about why he wanted to write this book and his journey as a writer and growing up in the Baltimore area. And when I was doing I can't remember exactly how I came across the book, but I was doing some research on John and the things he has written about, and it was really amazing, like one story after another of things that I am interested in and I would write about if I was writing full time. But the subjects he writes about are very specific when it comes to music, and writes about a lot of the people that I like. He had an article about Jeff Tweedy, Margo Price. He wrote about NRBQ. I'm like, who writes about NRBQ? I mean, they're a great band and everything, but you don't read a lot of articles about them. Anyway, it was just I was checking off the boxes in terms of John's writing resume, and I was like, oh my God, all these things I find very interesting. And he wrote a recent piece about Buddy Bolden, which we are also going to talk about. So I enjoyed the book. It is a little bit of journalism and biography and anthropology, I guess you could say. But it is about a Virginia town, and I am here in Virginia. And this whole idea of the honky tonks is kind of an interesting thing because there aren't many left. John talks about the Troubadour in his book, which is in West Virginia, not too far from Winchester. And they're hard to find these days. I mean, honky tonks, juke joints, these places that are in the mythology of country music and blues music and Americana. But they're usually these sort of rundown places, but are very cool and maybe have some great music, but it's a shot and pitcher beer kind of place. I talked to John about the Whitewater in Little Rock, which I wrote about for the Encyclopedia of Arkansas, and surprisingly no one that I know of has written a book about the Whitewater, though they should. So they are out there, but you're talking maybe one or two of these kinds of places in a state. And if you're not in the South, I didn't grow up in the South, there probably aren't anything like it. You maybe have some rundown bars and dive bars and everything. Little Rock was a great town for that kind of place that has music and cheap booze and some food. So the honky tonks are definitely a dying breed, but they make up the landscape of early country, and you still hear country musicians talk about this sometimes in a song as more of kind of a cliche or a trope than anything that really exists for most people. Richmond is a place with no shortage of bars and restaurants, but none of them are what I would call honky tonks. And with the economy being what it is now, and COVID ruining restaurants and bars, and people having to social distance, I wonder how the Troubadour is doing, and other places like it. But every now and then I kind of have this fantasy. You go through stages in your life and think about opening a business. Maybe decades ago, I thought about opening a bookstore, but it seems like bookstores have been dying off. And then I thought about, well, maybe a record store, but the logistics of that are tough, and the economy is rough now. And then every now and then I have kind of a honky tonk fantasy. When I was in Colonial Beach, the last place I lived, there were a couple of decent music venues there for a small town, but it's on the Potomac, not far from Maryland, actually. But there was this one spot that I said, well, if I was going to open a music venue, it would be this place. It was very run down, but a decent amount of space, not far at all from the water, kind of place where you would have a stage that would basically just be the floor, but you maybe get some good walk-in traffic actually from the people going to the beach or going to the other music events. But that's a fantasy, and I don't know if the place was even for sale, but it wasn't being used. But it was about a block or two from my house and was in the downtown area. So every now and then I still kind of fantasize about opening a business, but I checked about a place in my neighborhood here thinking it'd be a great spot for a record store because it's right on Lakeside Ave. You get some good drive-by traffic and maybe some people from the neighborhood, but the guy told me it was $1,200 for rent, and I thought, you start doing logistics in your head, $1,200 just to make rent, and obviously I'd have to quit my job, do this full time. You're talking, thousands and thousands of dollars a month you'd have to make just to break even. So if you are a realistic person, you can get out of that mindset fairly quickly, but it is kind of fun to fantasize about quitting your job and opening a business you've always wanted to open, or maybe one you just think it would be cool to open and run. But now is not a great time to open a business, but still people are doing it, obviously, at restaurants too. But I don't know, man. Just trying to hold on here with the COVID, and obviously nothing has really improved since this all started. It's been about the same since June when I started going back to work in a limited way. But otherwise, just going to the store and making sure I'm masked up and the kids are masked up if we do leave the house. But I'm trying to stay home as much as possible and doing the podcast and still talking to interesting folks. So it was nice talking with John about his book and all the things he's writing about. And he's writing a book on Creedence Clearwater Revival. And hopefully he'll have that done about the next year, and really look forward to reading that because I love Creedence and Fogerty, and roots rock has been my thing for a while. The Johnny Cash book. So I hope you will enjoy this. Me and John Lingan. Congratulations on your upcoming child. This is number 3.
Yes, it is. Yeah, we're having a little Corona baby, just to make sure the year doesn't, it doesn't get too calm. Everyone's
right.
It's been so easy. We just wanted to throw another monkey wrench in the bike spokes here, but yeah, so far we're not early. He is yet to arrive, so if something transpires in the next hour or so, I'll let you know, and we might cut it short, but I think we'll probably be okay.
I think it would be cool if we had an on-air birth, maybe.
I'll see what I can do. Yeah, I'll see what I can round up. See if we can get some breaking news here for you.
I'm assuming you're going to go to the hospital. Are you doing it there or at home?
It's at we're going to do it at a hospital. We live pretty close to one up here in Montgomery County, Maryland. Now, where are you? Are you down in North Carolina?
No, I am in Richmond.
Richmond, okay.
Yes, I work at Hampton, Sydney. I don't know if you've ever been out that way.
No, I haven't. I've never been to Richmond, which is actually kind of strange. But
okay,
I think I've had some ideas for reporting trips to go down there, but I've just somehow, and I've obviously been all over the state to different places, but I've somehow never made it to Richmond itself. So one day, eventually, I hope.
Well, it's funny because I just finished your book on Winchester, which I really enjoyed a lot, and congratulations on that. But it's a hike from Richmond. I've never been to Winchester.
Yeah, it is.
Which, I don't know, is maybe 3 hours from Richmond. I'm not really sure exactly.
That whole experience gave me an appreciation for how enormous Virginia is.
Right.
It really is kind of it's pretty big for an East Coast state. There's not a lot of other East Coast places that can kind of compare just landmass wise. And that, of course, means a lot of, sort of geographical diversity as well. I spent some time in Virginia Beach when I was growing up. Winchester's super close to where I am, so it wasn't even that big of a thing. I spent a little bit of time in Southwest Virginia, but it's just big. It's a big state.
It is. Well, I've talked about it before on the podcast, and it's not, statistically, it's not even one of the bigger states geographically. No. But if you go from, if you could drive a car from the eastern shore, like Chincoteague, out to Bristol, that'd be at least 8 hours. It's an enormous drive.
Right.
So no, it's a big state, and even like Winchester's, usually people know Northern Virginia for them is like Fairfax and Arlington and stuff, but
Sure.
Winchester's pretty much almost in Pennsylvania. I mean, you got a little strip of, well, what is it? It's directly north of Winchester is West Virginia, right?
Funnily enough, because I'm from Maryland, which I don't consider the South, although people north of us typically do, but Winchester is north of where we are in terms of longitude, latitude, and so it's a little bit sort of west northwest of where I am in the Maryland suburbs of DC. So it's kind of like a bedroom community for that Northern Virginia area you spoke about, Falls Church and that kind of thing, like what most people think when they think of Northern Virginia, which is just that immediate DC orbit. And then when you get up there in that hump, yeah, it's like when you're in Winchester, if you go north on Route 522, in about 40 minutes you hit the West Virginia line, and then you pass in and out of West Virginia in about 20 minutes, 20 to 30 minutes. It's like in a very small strip of the Eastern Panhandle, and then you hit Maryland, and Maryland you're in and out of in almost the same amount of time, because it's the thinnest part of Maryland too. So you can really go Virginia, West Virginia, Maryland into Pennsylvania in like maybe an hour and a half. Like you can really, if you're really just looking to cross like states off a list, of like places you've been to, that's a pretty good. Route 522 is a really good place to do that. But you can really come in and out because it really is where all these states are just kind of stacked on top of each other like pancakes.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you could hit 4 states pretty easily: Virginia, West Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania. It's kind of when it was sort of the Army of Northern Virginia during the Civil War, they kept going up the Shenandoah Valley into Maryland and then into Pennsylvania, landing up in Gettysburg. So like, yeah, you just have to cross a little bit and then you're into the north there. But obviously, West Virginia broke off. So the Virginia we live in now, I mean, it could have been way bigger if West Virginia had not sliced itself away. So I think back in the days, I mean, Virginia was even bigger than it is now.
It truly was.
So yeah, I've kind of become obsessed with geography as I get older, because as you said, I mean, the country is just so big, and even if you live in a certain state, there's so much of it you've probably never seen. And I actually went into Western Maryland last year for a job interview in Frostburg.
Oh, you must have been visiting what used to be known as Frostburg University and is now, is it Western Maryland?
I think it's called Frostburg State, but it's part of the University of Maryland system.
Right, I'm thinking of a different place. Yeah, okay. But I know, I'm a Maryland guy for life, so I'm familiar with Frostburg, sure. Yeah.
But it's basically, it's like West Virginia. I mean, it's really hilly. They get a lot of snow. And
well, I love, this is for a Marylander, a good cocktail party thing I like to bring up is that we do have in Maryland a small but kind of rabid secession movement for the 5 westernmost counties in Maryland. Pretty much once you get sort of past that thin part that I mentioned, because Maryland is not a big state, but it's incredibly geographically diverse, and it's very funny to think that the same state that if you live in Western Maryland, like you said, you're basically in the Alleghenies, and then it's funny to think that the capital, I mean the sort of economic center of the state is in Baltimore, which is obviously very like a few hours east of that, and then the political center is in Annapolis, which is an hour east of that. And then if you go another hour and a half east of that, you get into, the Atlantic beaches and Ocean City and those kinds of things. So I don't want them to secede, and I'm not a secessionist movement guy myself, but I can understand why a person all the way out there would think, what the hell does an Annapolis person have to know about our life out there? Because you're absolutely right. It has far more to do with those sort of mountainous counties in West Virginia and Western Pennsylvania than it does with anything in Baltimore or east of that.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's definitely a lot of diversity. And if you talking about Annapolis, I've never actually been to Annapolis. I've been to Baltimore a number of times, and it sounds like you're pretty much in the DC suburbs. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep, Central Maryland, that's for sure.
Well, one thing I want to ask before we go any further, how do you pronounce your last name?
I always say that it rhymes with singing in the rain, so it's just John Lingan.
Lingan?
Lingan, yeah.
Okay.
Not Lingan. Sometimes I've gotten that. Sometimes people make the second N into an M, which I don't understand. That's apparently a like an ancient term for the male genitalia, like in the Kama Sutra. So we're Lingan.
Oh, Lingan. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, that's good. Is that an Irish name?
Lord only knows.
Okay.
Yeah, I think on that side of my family, and this is great. I love giving. We're really giving some deep historical context here for the listeners here. I believe on that side of my family, it's mostly German and English. I think we have a little Irish in there somewhere that is probably overstated, like a lot of white Americans do. I don't think it's an Irish name. My grandmother's name was Nikki, her last name was Nikki, which sounds Irish. But I think both of my grandparents on my father's side were, like Pennsylvania German stock. Right. So I think it's from somewhere in there. But Lord only, proper Central European mutt heritage on that side for sure.
Well, I actually did the 23andMe a while back, a couple of years ago, and there were no surprises. I think the only surprise was my family goes a little bit into Southern Europe, so like there's some Italian in there.
Okay.
Which, who knows what that means exactly, but other than that, it was like purely Northern European, Irish, Scottish, English. So, I'm about as white as they come.
We have some Carpathian Mountain Jewishness on my mom's side. My mom is Jewish, and that side of the family I always think of as coming from New York, but they, in terms of their genetic heritage and where they emigrated from, it's Romania and Moldova. So that sounds exotic. More so than England maybe, but I can't say that I feel it running through my veins so much.
Well, the Carpathians, that's some wild country out there. Like,
I'll get there one day.
yeah, it's probably like West Virginia a little bit, but maybe scarier even than West Virginia, if that's possible.
If I went over to the mountains there and found it was less scary than West Virginia, I'd be very disappointed. That would be a huge letdown.
Not to bust on West Virginia, at a coworker who she was from there, and she was very nice, and I'm sure it's very pretty. But it's interesting you talk about secession movement in Western Maryland, because when I was there for a couple days, and obviously the Trump flags and everything are ubiquitous now, but there was definitely a Confederate flag I saw, and I think it was Cumberland maybe was the town. Yeah, so
Cumberland is kind of like the gateway to Western Maryland. Like once you hit there, you're in you start seeing the mountains in a different way, and you can feel it. Like we're not in Baltimore anymore. We're not in like because from Baltimore it moves into sort of kind of flat agricultural land for a little while on Route 70, as I'm sure you're familiar with, and then Cumberland is the kind of like welcome to the new territory. You're somewhere else now.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people, when they think of a certain place, obviously they think of a big city, but pretty much every state in the country, you can hit the countryside pretty quickly, and
Mm-hmm.
regardless of where you are, it's very country. I mean, the Western Maryland felt very country to me, and I grew up in Massachusetts, but I mean, you get 20 miles outside of Boston, you're definitely hitting, countryside and stuff. And
Mm-hmm.
I grew up in the country, small town, so it still exists. But you said are you from Maryland originally? Like you were born there?
I was born close to where I live now, and then I grew up in a town called Catonsville, south of Baltimore. So I'm a suburban Baltimorean since birth, and have been in Maryland pretty much all my life except for college. So yeah, this is for better or for worse. This is where I'm from. Seen a lot of that flag in my times. We have that flag. People are wearing COVID masks with that flag now because we feel it's our birthright to put that flag on every possible material and everything else that we can.
Well, yeah, it's like the ultimate unspoken FU. It's like, well, I'm going to wear a mask, but I'm still going to stick it to the man with the rebel flag on it.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm still, well, not yet. I'm talking about the Maryland state flag, which
I'm sorry.
No, dude, don't worry, because the Maryland state flag, we are very proud of it. If you've ever spent any time, or at least maybe not the secessionists aren't as proud of it, I don't know. But that weird one with it's got the red and white design and the black and gold design, which are the Calvert and Lord Baltimore seals, or those different flags. So it's kind of the rural and urban flags combined into a very funky looking pattern there. And in central and eastern Maryland, you can't throw a stone without hitting something emblazoned with that pattern on it. So I think by the fall they'll have found a way to somehow make like an Old Bay scented COVID mask, which I'm holding out for, which would really complete it. But yeah, for now it's just we keep that pattern on everything we can.
Well, it's good to hear you. I mean, most people probably don't know what the hell their state flag is, so it obviously you like it. You've got some pride in the state. And I just talked to an old friend of mine. He's a professor up in New York now, but he grew up in Baltimore. This guy named Chris Leahy, and wrote a book about John Tyler. So he's been to Virginia for. I mean, he doesn't live in Virginia, but he's done a lot of history on it.
Sure.
So it's nice to hear good stories about Baltimore, because I hate to always bring this up, but I'm watching The Wire now for the third time around.
I knew it was coming.
If it's not John Waters, it's The Wire, right?
And it's very rarely John Waters, but that's it was John Waters when I lived in England for a year during college. Some people brought him up there, but if someone says, I hate to bring this up, I know, here it comes. It's on its way.
But I like Baltimore. I've been there a number of times, and I root for the city, because you watch The Wire. It's like this horrifying, battle between cops and drug dealers. But there's a lot more to it than that. And that show kind of shows you the whole city, shows you newspaper guys, it shows you the dock workers and everything. So.
Well, let me. I'll make a confession, which is that I have only seen one season of The Wire myself. I saw season 4, the one about the schools, and
yes.
I saw that while it was airing, because I was in school, and some friends of mine were like, "You haven't seen this show? Jesus, it's amazing!" And so I watched it, and yeah, it was incredible. That was amazing. But after some of that stuff, I was like, I don't know if I can take this anymore. I was just like, this is so.
Yeah.
It's so wrenching. I'm probably the only person. Certainly the only one I know who has seen only one season of The Wire, but the entirety of David Simon's following show, Treme, about New Orleans. So I've seen the full run of Treme, but only season 4 of The Wire. So I hope when this goes out, I don't get my Maryland citizenship revoked or something like that.
Well, maybe it's one of those things, it's like true Marylanders don't watch The Wire in the same way true New Yorkers don't go to Times Square on New Year's Eve. It's like,
Yeah, well, I mean, I also, it's important to me too, because if we are to talk at all about the sort of Maryland and Baltimore, because I did grow up near the city, but not in the city. And I do want to be very clear that that's like an important distinction, that a suburban, like that's when I tell people I'm from the Baltimore area and they say, "Oh, The Wire," it's like I completely understand, but like my childhood could not have been more different than the childhood of people who grew up, literally 10 miles away from me, and that who's and it's like I have lived in the city, and I have friends who have been teachers in the city, and who, I have friends there now as well. So I do know the town, but I do not at all want to overstate my, how native I am, or like my claim to the city itself, or my knowledge, my ability to speak for those problems, because I honestly know it from the news and from I guess I have done some interviewing and some research and writing on that area, but I wouldn't call myself an expert just because I grew up nearby.
Well, I understand that, and I don't want to make it sound like everyone that watches The Wire who's from Baltimore or Maryland like needs to take responsibility for what's going on in it, because I don't want to talk about this too much, but I mean, if you had set that show in, say, Richmond 10 years earlier, it would have been the same show. I mean, the drugs here, the violence, I mean, it was out of control, and started to kind of pull out of that around the first time I moved here, because I moved here first time in 2005, and it really was just kind of emerging from that horrible gang drug period from like the late 80s into the 90s with just record crime and everything. And it's, we still have problems with that, but it's definitely gotten much better. But I'm glad you've watched all Tremaine. I love that show, man. That's a terrific show. And
I thought it was amazing. And
I did too.
As you know, I'm amateur New Orleans enthusiast, and I thought that was a beautiful show. I thought this, in terms of, it had its cheese, for sure, but I thought in terms of the way that I felt that way that other people not from Baltimore must feel about The Wire, which is like you watch it and you feel like the place, because it's just the imagery of it is so vivid, the acting of it was so amazing, and the way that they kind of brought all those characters together and sort of showed the way that they overlap in this patchwork, I thought was amazing. I honestly would say that it was an influence on Homeplace. I don't know to what degree that would ever come through to somebody, but I did watch it during the time when I was writing that book, and I thought if I could do something like this, that would be great. But I loved that. And I also loved it for being emotionally very diverse. It wasn't it wasn't only like look at the destruction, look at the anger, look at the violence, and the, that kind of thing. There was celebration. There were, people whose, troubles were relatively small compared to others. There were people from the city, from outside the city. I adored it. I loved that show, and it had so much music in it too. It was great.
Yeah, it's a really rich show in the way that The Wire is, and even though both of the shows are essentially about a city in trauma, it has kind of a widespread PTSD issue going on. It is, there are very clearly defined characters, and there's like, there's hopelessness, but also, people just kind of living their lives and trying to get through this chaos. And it's a bit easy. I mean, there's some rough stuff in Treme, but I think generally, because a lot of it is about musicians, it's not quite as harsh as The Wire. And
the music just gives everything a little hope.
Yeah.
Like the music is just like it. And this is, I guess, why I like writing about it too, is it just sort of like whatever else is going on, it encapsulates that, it reflects that, but it also exists on a kind of a different plane. It's historically such a great way for people who do have troubles to surmount them, or sort of direct them in a positive direction, or well, what a bad sentence that was. But it's a way to sort of overcome that trauma, channel it a little bit.
Right.
It's marvelous show, marvelous.
Well, in a lot of ways, I mean, New Orleans has been there before. I mean, again and again.
Yeah.
And it could happen. Katrina, maybe they're out of the woods this year with the hurricanes, but I live down there in South Louisiana, and it's another world. And you sent me your recent piece about the Buddy Bolden house. It was very interesting to me. You did actually cite, I don't know if you had a quotation from him, but Wendell Pierce, who played the trombone player on Treme, he's kind of involved with that.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about, I mean, I'm just going to kind of skip all over here because your writing is so diverse and so interesting to me. But since this is kind of your most recent one and it relates a lot to what we just talked about, talk a little bit about the Buddy Bolden house.
So the Buddy Bolden house is a pretty nondescript double shotgun in Central City in New Orleans that is only of interest architecturally or historically because it was once the home of Buddy Bolden, who you would have to be a sort of jazz historian or jazz history interested person to know who he was, but he was an incredibly important figure in the development of jazz and the development of New Orleans jazz in particular. He was the originator of basically what we consider to be modern jazz. He was the kind of originator of what was at that time was called head music. He was the first person to kind of like break away from playing charts or establish things and do what we now consider to be improvisation. His legend is enormous. He was a direct influence on Jelly Roll Morton and Louis Armstrong and countless other black and white, I suppose, musicians at that time. But he also never recorded, and that's because he essentially went insane and never played a note after about 1907. So this is the house where he lived for the decade or so leading up to that point when he was a young man into his early mid-20s. And now the house still stands, the structure still stands, and it is owned by a prominent black family, the Mortons, who are also, I mean, they are not just prominent figures in New Orleans. They are prominent because they operate a church, the Greater St. Stephen's Christian Church down there. So, which is, I hesitate to call it a mega church. That has certain connotations, but there are, and specifically before the hurricane, membership in the thousands. And so they have owned the Buddy Bolden house, which again it's not officially known as that. It's just people who know he grew up there know that he grew up there, but there's no historical markings or anything of any kind. I think in the late 70s it was given a proper historical designation by the state of Louisiana, or no, by the city of New Orleans, but there's no, other than that, there's no like protection or, I mean, it isn't even, occupiable right now. You couldn't live in it now. And so the question that I went down there to try and answer is why does this house just sort of sit there as a derelict, unused building when it is unquestionably a structure of historical and cultural significance, and it's owned by a family that appears to have a fair amount of money, certainly a fair amount of clout with the city council and other local things. So the story is that they purchased this house in 2008. It is across the street. It's part of a group of similar aged homes in a lot right across the street from one of their kind of satellite congregations. There's a church building across the street that right after they purchased these properties, this church building had a fire. And so since 2008, this large church building has been sitting behind fencing with, sort of I guess it's kudzu and other kinds of vines growing up the side. It's not usable. It's still has yet to be rehabbed from what I can tell on the inside. It's a great big brick structure. And then there's this group of disused homes as well. So the Mortons have never explained why they purchased the property or what their plans for it were. You can guess, and I want to be clear that this is a guess, but it is right across the street from this large building. And if the Buddy Bolden house and its neighbors were taken down, it would make a large parking lot. So I'll just say that. But after a few years of fines, because the house, because it has been designated as a historic property, it does have certain protections in play. So for the last few years, and I mean like in the last decade, the city has levied fines against the church for not taking care of it. They have levied fines, I guess, against the family, although the sort of difference between the family and the church is hard to discern. And so maybe 2 years ago, the Morton's son announced that he was going to start this foundation, the Buddy's House Foundation, and he was going to rehab it as a museum and combination like community center. And it turns out that their son his name is PJ Morton, who is a pretty very well established sort of R&B star in his own right as a solo star, and he's also a member of Maroon 5 at this point. He's a keyboardist for Maroon 5. So this is a guy with connections and with money. The way that Wendell Pierce came up in the article is that PJ told me that Wendell Pierce is one of a few different sort of local celebrities who have promised their involvement or support or whatever else it might be when the project gets off the ground. But I went down there in February to find out if this is off the ground at all. And I really read the article, but I can't say that it is. I don't think that.
No.
Certainly the house itself has not received any help as a result of this, and they don't have a board membership. They don't have any kind of sort of fundraising or nonprofit infrastructure that you would think. And it's especially frustrating because there are a number of people who I suppose are the sort of protagonists of the article who want and know how to rehab and save houses like this. Right around the corner from the Buddy Bolden house is the Kid Ory house. Kid Ory was another sort of disciple of Buddy Bolden. He did end up recording, and he was another one of these sort of like extremely important Mount Rushmore figures of New Orleans jazz. And where he originally grew up is now it's a designated place, but a historic property, but it has a kind of seal outside and a historic marker, but it's a public-private partnership. So it is a privately owned house. There's a family that lives there, but that family bought it and understands that there are certain limitations on what they can do. And obviously the fact that Kid Ory lived there was one of the selling points. So it's like there are precedents in New Orleans for both sides. Honestly, there are precedents for properties that have been rehabbed and found a second life and have found preservation, and there are precedents for this is true all over the place, including in Baltimore, where they just this weekend ripped down Cab Calloway's old house. There are precedents for just letting these properties fall to the ground and rot, and in some cases actively be destroyed. I don't think because of the historic designation that the Mortons or anyone else could actively raise the property, but you could make an argument, and it's hard not to, that they are just kind of waiting for the elements to have their way. They haven't done anything to honestly preserve the structural integrity of the place, and so you kind of worry that God, a hurricane comes by. There are well-built buildings that don't withstand hurricanes, and this is a 120-year-old structure that barely has, it has rotting wood, in the inside and the infrastructure of it. So I hope one way or the other that they're able to turn the tide and preserve this thing. But the article that I wrote is just sort of a history of how this happened and why, as best I can tell, it happened.
Yeah, it's it's a good article, but it's also very frustrating to read. And as someone who's lived in that part of the country and been to New Orleans a bunch of times. I love the city, but it really just encapsulates what goes on there in terms of preservation. And there's all these things wrapped up into it with race and class and everything. And you would think, since it's an African-American family that owns the land, they'd maybe be more willing to preserve it than, say, some whatever real estate company or lawyer, whatever, I don't know. But this just happens again and again. And I mean, to get back to Treme, there's so much of that in that show where, you know, Davis is giving the tour of the French Quarter and he's talking about all these old time jazz guys, blues guys, and they're like, where's his house? The tourists ask him. He's like, oh, that got knocked down. He's like, oh, yeah, this one got knocked down. It's like, this is the same thing. And you're right. If they don't do something quickly, it might just collapse in on itself, and then it's pretty much gone.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a healthy looking structure there.
No,
and it's not a, you know, it's a modest street that it's on, but every other house is pretty much occupied, and it's a lively residential street. So we're not talking about a property that's like at the end of an alley or something like that. This is a neighborhood where people live, you know, right across the street. It's, you know, there's, you know, people could live in this house if they wanted to, but for whatever reason, it's just not happening. And there's a lot of racial class dynamics in play, but that's what can I say? That's the stuff that gets me going, I guess.
Yeah, well, you know, you've kind of packed an entire book's amount of themes and material kind of into one articles. But no, I mean, this just plays itself out again and again in the United States. And I was in Arkansas for a while, and I was doing a lot of work on Johnny Cash, and luckily they preserved his house in Dias where he grew up. It's not a residential area. It's just kind of middle of nowhere. But
when you say preserved, is it a museum? Does somebody live there?
It's a museum, okay. And it was part of a New Deal project to create a site for farmers. So everyone pretty much got 20 acres. So there's a lot of farmland up there, and it's flat. It's like Kansas pretty much. But they turned his house into a museum. They do tours there, and then the center of town, there's a couple buildings. They've created a gift shop, a lecture hall, and things like that. So they've done a lot of work there.
Wow.
But it's a small town. You're an hour from Memphis. There's not really much between there and Memphis if you're going to the south. Right. So it's kind of just out there. So that has advantages and disadvantages. But they really had to work hard to wrench this property from a guy who owned it, who didn't do anything to keep it out. It was condemned. So
wow, okay,
it would have just collapsed in on itself had they Arkansas State University not bought it. But it just, that so reminded me of that when I was reading about Buddy Bolden. And yeah, I mean, he's not a household name the way Louis Armstrong is, but when you're looking at the cost that it would take to preserve this compared to other structures in this country, I mean, it's like a pittance, you know. But
the house where he lived, you know, because again, it's a double shotgun, so he only lived in one side, and you can't get inside the structure. But I mean, just from the outside, we're talking like 1,000 square feet. You know what I mean? Like, it's not the idea that money is an issue is like laughable. I mean, it's insane. You know, it would take relatively nothing to make that.
I would imagine. So I guess, you know, that's kind of a story in progress. You said you were there in February, so it's just before COVID you did the story?
I was, it was my last, I've barely been, you know, a mile from my house since then, but yeah, and it was in late February, right between Mardi Gras and the end of the world. So, and I know that New Orleans in particular at the beginning of this had a really tough early going with COVID. So, I mean, I just lucked into a period right in the middle, like between, because I wouldn't have gotten any work done if I'd gone there for Carnival, but you know,
right.
I found the window. I just happened to find the exact window, and if I hadn't gotten there when I did, I don't know that I would have been there at all.
Well, it's interesting because I'm sure you probably thought about this, but in looking at your work, I mean, this isn't always the case, but you definitely have this theme, and it's certainly in Homeplace, but this kind of, you like to hit subjects that do kind of deal with the sense of place and your home or getting back there or whatever. I mean, obviously in Homeplace, that's a central theme, but I was reading your piece on It's a Wonderful Life, which is kind of all about that idea of like, you don't need to move away, you know, you can create this world for you here. And even you talk to someone like Tweedy, I think that's what he's about in a way too. I mean, his book is called Let's Go So We Can Come Back, or something,
Yeah, right,
something
right.
like that. But in Homeplace, you again, someone who's studied the dyes history in Arkansas and preservation stuff across the country. I mean, it's all kind of here in this book. I mean, this whole idea of trying to preserve what's there, a town that's kind of beat up like Winchester, but it's got some good things going on. Why did you want to? You know, this is a very obvious question, but like, why do you want to write about Winchester?
So I wanted to write about Patsy Cline first. You know, there was
Okay.
I do tend to write about music. I do tend to write about what I say is like everyone's grandparents' music. You know, it's like I don't tend to write about contemporary music. I'm not like a music critic or anything like that. So I guess it's more sort of like the historical and sociocultural ideas behind it. And I late 2012 or so, I was listening to Patsy Cline, and that's the part of it that I can't really understand. I can't really understand why I was listening to her at that point, because I liked country music, okay, but it's odd to me that it would have just been sitting around listening to her, and
Right.
had this moment of thinking that she was barely country at all, that it was like this, you know, that there really wasn't what I would consider sort of classic country in some of the sounds. This would have been her later stuff. I think it wasn't She's Got You, but it was one of those like big syrupy dramatic songs that she sang in 62 and 63. And so I just was poking around looking for her, and I found that she came from this town of Winchester, Virginia. Well, first she came from Virginia, which I was like, oh, that's interesting. That's not like, it's not like Deus, Arkansas, you know, or like something that, you know, like the towns that we consider those classic country people to come from. And then when I actually
Right.
saw where Winchester was from, you know, it's an hour and a half from where I live. And that just happened to be, so this was late 2012. And what that means that we were coming up on the 50th anniversary of her death in 1963. So this would have been in May of 1963 that she died in a plane crash with two other country musicians on the way back to Nashville. They crashed in the Tennessee forest outside of Nashville as they were kind of preparing to descend, or descending a little too early, I guess. And so I thought, oh, great. Well, there's like this town not far away from me that will surely be having some kind of commemoration event of some kind for this world famous singer who died 50 years ago. And I can just go there because that's a music story. It's, you know, there were people around. At that point, I was not like I was certainly not an established, and I was not an experienced, what we call feature writer. So I was sort of looking for excuses to go to places and see things with my own eyes and then describe them and interview people and do a little background. Like I just was trying to see if that was something I could do. And so I really threw myself into this project, and it was very Patsy music focused. And then when I went to the town and saw her surprisingly mixed legacy and met a lot of people who knew her and who had seen her when they were children and who were born after she died and sort of grew up with her as this kind of mythic local figure, that's when I became interested in the town itself. And so I wrote this long article about that weekend because there was a commemoration of her death. There was a 50th anniversary event, but it was not a huge thing. There wasn't like a parade or a town-wide memorial by any means. It was a relatively small gathering of people, but I met a lot of people in town, and that's when I sort of figured, once I got done with that article, I realized it was the town that interested me, because there was this whole thing where, like, the reason she had this mixed reception was that the town was historically really split between haves and have-nots, and the people that were the haves were like truly the haves, and in Virginia that really means something. Virginia really prides itself on not being Arkansas, not being Mississippi. Like, they're very big on, like, we're the cradle of presidents, it's the mother of presidents, I think, and they call themselves the Commonwealth. And so the old moneyed families that are there, have been there since the early 18th century. This is old stuff. And Winchester as a town was incorporated in the 1740s. So when we talk about, like, the old money, we're talking old money,
Right.
And people that telling them that, hey, there's a really famous country singer in town, the first thing they would ask is like, well, where is she from? And when you tell them she's from South Kent Street, it's just like, pish posh, we don't care about her at all. Like, so there was this very bizarre,
Yeah.
and it kind of still holds. Like, I have met people in Winchester who are kind of like dismissive of her in a certain way because she's like a hussy or whatever else. But it's just that was the thing that really made me feel I had a book. You know what I mean? Even, and when I wrote this immensely long article that effectively turned into what is now chapter 2 of Homeplace, it was a lot going on, but that Patsy story was kind of finished in that chapter or in that article. But I really still felt like there's something here. Like, it feels like a book. It's like when you watch because I was there with a photographer a friend of mine who took pictures for the book too, and for the article. And sometimes when you watch like a documentary movie, and like the filmmakers have made this, like, they found this like insane niche community somewhere, you're like, how did they find their way into this like kickball league in northern Alaska? Or how did they find how did they find the like the punk scene in the slums of Rio? Or it's just like, you just can't believe the scene that they found themselves in. And that's honestly what Winchester felt like. It was just like, how are we possibly just wandering around, and every person we speak to is just like ready to be sat down and videotaped talking, extemporaneously about their family history for 45 minutes to an hour. It was just, everywhere you went was just a new context. And so that was where we really, it took me a few years to figure out what the book was going to be, but I knew that I wanted to do something that kind of encapsulated all those ideas to whatever degree was possible.
Yeah, it's a very rich book, and you do have these people, like you say, they're very colorful, and you're able to sort of describe this town in a very interesting way. It's kind of a town, it's sort of walking that line between, well, a lot of things, kind of like the old South with the Civil War, but then the new South with someone like Patsy. But also it's kind of a town walking the line between just falling apart and kind of holding on to this legacy of old money and maybe a little bit of tourism and some things that are going on, a good music scene. You go to the Troubadour a lot, and Jim talked to Jim McCoy, and he's gone now, but like at the time he was still running that Honky Tonk. So in some ways it's doing a lot worse than a lot of towns, but also doing a lot better. I mean, a lot of towns that are like this, but there's nothing. I mean, there's no Patsy Cline house. There's no old money. It's just like a kind of bombed out, depressed area. Kind of, I mean, I hate to say, like, kind of where I grew up, it was an old mill town. The jobs left. They never came back, and there's nothing to do.
Where did you grow up? What
I grew up in the small town, Barre, Mass. It's in Worcester County, so you're like 30 miles west of Worcester, kind of between, Amherst and Worcester. So it's country. There's
I
nothing
believe
going
it's
on.
spelled Worcester.
It looks like that.
If you're a Kennedy, didn't he just misspell that on the? My sister's up in Cambridge, so I got periodic dispatches of that whole thing. But yeah, he put an H in Worcester in a piece of campaign material, which was.
I don't know if he ever went out that far, because it's like another it's another country. If you go outside of Boston,
it's not Hyannisport. Yeah, sure.
You're in the woods. Yeah. So I think you're right. I think a lot of towns, like, oh my God, if someone wrote a book like about Petersburg or something here, which is, I think, kind of gone through this same process of trying to hold on to some tourism dollars and the history, but it's rough. So I like how you kind of navigate different parts of town, talking to different people. And one guy that I really liked was, I don't know if you ever met him or talked to him, Joe Bajan.
Mm-hmm.
Did you ever talk to him?
So Joe, I first went to Winchester in 2013, as I said, and Joe died in 2011.
Okay.
So I missed him.
Okay.
And so the way that he sort of, and thank you for bringing him up, because I loved that chapter and I loved getting to know him. So I never met him personally. I spent a lot of time, and when I go out there, I still see his delightful widow, Barbara, who still lives in town, and I got to know her very well. But we were ships in the night, and God, I wish he were still around. But what happened there was, I went out to Winchester to do the Patsy thing, and then people told me, you should come back again. You should meet this Jim McCoy guy and spend some time with him. And so I started going back, and a few of these chapters in the book were articles, including the Joe Bajan one. So that was an article for the Baffler. So I had to rejigger them all to sort of, turn them into book chapters rather than standalone articles. But they definitely started as standalone pieces. And for those first few times I was going out to Winchester, I had like something about the name of the town sounded familiar. And that's silly because, of course, like there's a Winchester, England, there's the Winchester rifle. Like it's not of course that name sounds familiar. But then eventually I realized, and I don't know how my memory got jogged or whatever, but I realized that this was the town that I used to read about when I was in college. And I would occasionally read this just like frothing mad lefty blogger. And he would talk about his just like, he wasn't, again, because we're not describing one of these beat up old towns like you said. It's not just rednecks sitting around this place,
right.
And I use that term affectionately. It's not just a bombed out post-industrial wasteland out there. He would complain about that moneyed, Republican landowning class. And, I met one of his good friends and interviewed that guy at length he was a real estate developer who told me about being at a party with some of these people and asking somebody if they knew about The Great Gatsby, and somebody responded, "No, where's he from?" So like, that's who he hated. So Joe right. was a kind of like a proud redneck himself, and was grew up lower class from a broken home that was kind of forced off the mountains because of the economic changes that occurred. And he moved down into Winchester with his family and then experienced, pretty traumatic, just sort of really hand-to-mouth poor living in a place with a real overclass. It wasn't,
right.
Which is, I think you're right in distinguishing. Winchester is not it's not like, I know there was a book that came out around the same time called Janesville about Wisconsin, and people, this is not a Rust Belt book. This is not about the factory closed and the jobs went away and the Walmart moved in and everything. This is very like Winchester is kind of a thriving town in a lot of ways.
Right,
it's probably
right.
it's very much on the way to becoming a real commuter suburb of Washington D.C. It has a lot of tourism thanks to its connection to George Washington and Stonewall Jackson. There's a small but pretty, I don't know about lucrative or whatever, but it's, it's a busy school. There is a college there, and it's, it's not at all like we said, it's not at all one of those just sort of like, towns torn to shreds by capitalism kind of things. But it is a
Right.
town, incredibly changed by capitalism, and there's an active debate about who controls the sort of narrative of it. And Joe is an important part of that. He was an important voice. I mean, he was probably the most. I mean, for a time at the tail end of the Bush administration, and I guess his book came out in 2008. His first book, called Deer Hunting with Jesus, was a kind of proto exegesis of what we now consider Trump country. He was sort of writing as a redneck, and as a frothing lefty redneck. So he was a fairly communist, almost kind of
Right.
kind of guy, and was just just absolutely could not abide any of the war and the trickle down stuff that he saw coming from the right wing at the time, but also hated the left wing because the left wing had by that point really kind of cast aside the rural part of the country and had sort of decided to become a more, well, frankly, racially diverse and let's say college educated kind of place. And he, I think, very smartly saw this, and I see this attitude now reflected in a lot of like podcasters and writers of my own age. I'm 35, so like this is an idea whose time has come. But he was one of the first people to point out that, like, if the Democratic Party would just come to these towns and put forth an economic idea of how to help people, they maybe wouldn't have to write off these people as irredeemable rednecks who are just always going to vote red. And so he was, I mean, I would read his blog posts when I was in college without really having any idea who he was or anything else. And then after spending some time in Winchester, I was like, wait a minute, this is the town. And I think it was because there's a really lovely bookstore downtown with, like, as bookstores in towns like that tend to do, with like a little local shelf. And I saw Deer Hunting with Jesus on it. I was like, this is the guy. Joe Bajan is from this is the town that he wrote about. These are the people that he hated. So from there, I was like, oh, cool, I can do an article about him and I can talk about his life. And it sort of became a biography, like a full sort of cradle to the grave biography of him in 7,000 words or so, because at that point he had died. But it was for a time I wanted to write a book about him because I find him just such an interesting guy, but I don't think there's the market for that. But he is a perfect example of how, like, you come to a town because you think it's one thing, and then it turns out that, like, the stuff that not only is there additional stuff that I became interested in, but there's like people who have already written about that stuff eloquently, hilariously, and that who have their own stories to tell that kind of illuminate those same topics as well. So that's what I mean when I sort of say, like, I saw all these pieces that were so fascinating, and it was like the challenge was to find a shape that could kind of encompass all of them, something that they could all sort of fit underneath, an umbrella for them all.
Yeah. Well, and, Patsy is definitely kind of the hook with this story because she's probably the most famous person to come out of Winchester, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
And everyone loves her music, but you're right. She kind of existed in this ethereal plane where, like, she could have been from anywhere to a certain degree.
Yeah.
And the fact that the local First Family Virginia types dissed her is heartbreaking, but also very understandable because there is that thing in America generally, but especially in Virginia. I mean, I hate to say it, but I'm not from here, so I can. But
Say it, man. Let's talk. Just,
I mean,
I've spent so many years talking smack about Virginia. This is becoming my brand, even though I love it
right.
and I have family there. But it's such an interesting state. Yeah.
Yeah, well, yeah, I worked for 4 years at Stratford Hall, which is the birthplace of Robert E. Lee, and
Okay. Yeah.
you're in Westmoreland County, where Washington came from. So there's that quote unquote aristocracy, which is to a large degree bullshit because Lee never had any real money of his own, and his dad was a disaster with money and everything. But there's that lineage that goes back to Jamestown or whatever 1600s, and I'd say Virginians have a pretty high opinion of themselves generally because of Jefferson, Washington, all those guys that died 200 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
But trying to break through that is incredibly frustrating. And Patsy Cline, who is, as immortal as any country star will ever be, she couldn't break through that because she wasn't from this aristocracy. And so you can kind of transplant this. I mean, I don't want to be ripping on Virginia too much, though I'm cool with doing that. But like, you could transplant the story to a lot of different places. I mean, you could set it down here in Richmond, no problem. I mean, you got the same issues of this sort of landed elite that bought up all the land initially. We still have stuff named after the Byrds. I was happy to see you talked about Senator Byrd, Harry Byrd, for a while because he was
incredible character. Yeah,
the Apple magnate.
Yeah.
And I didn't really know about that. I mean, I knew about all the horrible Jim Crow stuff, but I didn't know he was this businessman out in or up in Winchester. So that was all very interesting. But no, I mean, it's very frustrating because the American story is you work hard, you have talent, you can transcend where you came from, but there's always kind of these forces pushing down on you. So maybe that's the class element at work in the story. I mean, there's a certain amount of racial stuff going on here, but I'd say more so it's kind of, you're talking about the class issue in Winchester that people, and Jim McCoy too. I mean, the guy, he was a talented dude. He had this kind of cultural landmark, but he's never really quite made it. And so these stories are kind of sad to a certain degree, but also very cool because these people can kind of carve out a niche where they were, and after a certain amount of time, it's like, well, I run this honky tonk and people love me, so yeah, that's pretty good. But I mean, there's so much going on in this story with the politics and Trump. I mean, it's just it's very interesting to read. But the Troubadour, is that still open?
Yeah, it is actually.
Okay.
So it was the fate of it was uncertain as I was wrapping up this book, and shortly after that, it was purchased by a couple families from Northern Virginia, from what we were talking about earlier, the sort of suburban area, and I haven't been there in a little while, but they haven't changed it, at least physically, at all. I think they have more. I think they have metal nights now, as opposed to just country music. But honestly, good for them, because that's what people are listening to in that area. And I think they have some ladies' nights, promotions and that kind of thing. So it's evolved in its clientele, but that's just honestly just smart community-based business, running, as far as I'm concerned. And I don't think they've done anything to change the true character of it. Most importantly, Bertha still lives up there. This is Jim's wife, because Jim lived on the property with his wife, and about, door to door is about 100 feet from their trailer to the restaurant.
Yeah.
And so when they purchased the property, one of the conditions was that Bertha get to stay, so she didn't have to leave this beautiful view that she'd spent 30, 40 years of her life on. So it's still up there.
Yeah, I mean, Jim's story, I mean, it is like something out of a novel, and I'm assuming you saw that movie Crazy Heart, or maybe read the book.
Yeah, I saw the movie.
This is kind of like if the guy in Crazy Heart settled down and moved to Winchester, because he's in a trailer 100 feet from the honky tonk. I mean, it's just kind of a beautiful story.
Yeah.
But these honky tonks, I mean, definitely a dying breed, right? I mean, I don't know of anything like that around here.
Yeah, I mean, it's I have referred I think it's even in the book. But I've certainly, like, in the press stuff, and I've referred to it as the last honky tonk in the Virginias. No one has challenged me yet,
Yeah.
I'm not aware of any other ones, but that's, how it's certainly the only, like, place of its kind. There's a few pictures of it up there. I hope some of the descriptions that I give in the book sort of illuminate a little about what we're talking about. But we're talking about dark Christmas lights, all year round, pool tables in the back, plastic pitcher beer service, steak night, salad bar, little stage,
Yeah.
like every possible part of the wall just, like, covered in old Polaroids and like label 8x10s from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And then, I mean, you can't really say this about many places, but there is a genuine Patsy Cline gold record hanging behind the stage. So, like, the people who perform there, like, the metal bands that perform there now are performing in front of a gold record that was owned by Patsy Cline and her husband, who were close friends of Jim's for many years, and they gave it to him as a kind of, like, or I guess Patsy didn't give it to him, but because she died almost a quarter century before the Troubadour opened up. But eventually, when it did open up in the mid '80s, her widower Charlie gave that gold record, and that's quite a benediction, I'd say. I mean, there aren't a lot of, even if there are other places where you can smoke and eat a steak and drink a beer at the same time, I don't know any of them that can claim the kind of lineage that place can. It's pretty remarkable.
Well, I don't know. Have you ever been to Little Rock?
No, I haven't, sadly.
Well, if you ever go there, there's this place called the Whitewater that's not far from downtown Little Rock, but I think that's probably the only honky tonk I've ever been to, but it sounds a lot like the Troubadour. I haven't been up to Winchester, but it's the same kind of deal, like virtually no stage, pitcher beer, Christmas lights, like all these weird knickknacks and stuff. But they've had so many great people go in and out of there. It's kind of like the coolest place to play in Arkansas, and guys are either coming up from Austin or coming down from Nashville. So it's kind of on the highway, the alt country highway. But
the best part of writing this book and promoting it, I guess, is that I keep meeting people who tell me about places like that.
That's
like,
cool.
I now feel like any city I go to, I'm like, I need to check back with that person who told me, like, here's the dingy roadhouse. It's like, when you write a book about a smoky country bar, everyone wants to tell you about their favorite smoky country bar, and keep it coming, everyone. This is it's not a bad bucket list to build here at all.
I wish there were more places like it, and there just aren't. I mean, there's kind of some places in Richmond that have a certain cachet. They're kind of a throwback, but they've been around for like a year or two, so they're kind of going for that, but it's not necessarily authentic. But that's cool. And do you find it kind of odd that, like, these stories kind of need to be written by outsiders? I mean, you're not from there.
I don't know if they need to be written by outsiders. I suppose, like, anybody could write. One of the things, there's a sort of funny motif in the book of, like, I keep meeting people who have written books, and books about local stuff, like Joe Bagent, for example. When I got up to Berkeley Springs, which is the little West Virginia town where the Troubadour is, about a half an hour, 40 minutes outside of Winchester, I met this woman, Jeannie Mosier, who is a local historian, and people write a lot about that area. George Washington led battles there. Stonewall Jackson lived there. It supposedly changed sides upwards of 70 times during the Civil War. I mean, it is a place that people write about. I would say that probably my book is probably one that an outsider would have to write about. I didn't have skin in the game. You know what I mean? It's
Right,
not like
right.
I wasn't there to defend anybody. I mean, I think you can tell my allegiances and probably even like my political leanings from reading it, but I wasn't coming there to say like Walmart ruined Winchester, and I wasn't coming there to say like every bar should be an old honky tonk, and down with Washington, down with Stone. It wasn't a Jeremiah to me. It was
No,
more just
no.
sort of like it was more interesting to observe how people were trying to make their way and make sense of all this history and all this legend. And I think, when you're in a town like that, where you're growing up, and this is just my sense of things from talking to people, but I can just put myself in the vantage point, or think about what it would be like to be a kind of, I don't want to say lower class, but like a sort of lower income person in Winchester, living on, one of the more affordable sides of town with, at this point, probably a pretty diverse group of neighbors. Maybe your parents work in a factory or in a school, or they may even work in the agricultural realm of things out there. And then when you hear about local history, you're hearing about George Washington and Stonewall Jackson and the Civil War. It's like, does that have, or even Patsy Cline? Like, does that have any relevance to you? I got
Right.
asked to speak with a high school class at Handley High School in Winchester, and so these would have been like 15, 16-year-olds. And when I asked them, in this school, this is where Patsy went to high school for at least a year or two, and the auditorium is named for her. It is the Patsy Cline Auditorium. And when I asked who had heard of Patsy Cline, it was like 3 hands went up, and like the 3, they were sort of like, she's a singer, right? And I do not say that to like bust the chops of young people. Like, why should
Right,
they care?
right.
It's like it's up to adults to contextualize these stories and make them relevant. And so I guess that this was about trying to figure out what kinds of history and what kinds of historical stories are relevant to people. Like, what do people who are from this area, what is the actual personal cultural benefit? What is the inheritance of these stories if you're a person who's actually from there? And I don't know if you have to be from the outside to see that. I wouldn't claim that my not being from there gives me any special insight, but it's the insight that I have. It allowed me to talk to a wider group of people and not have any preconceived notions about it. So I think
Right.
that does help. I can tell you too that I have no interest in writing a book about my own hometown, like, just because it's my hometown. It seems boring to me, even though it's not. Catonsville actually does have kind of an interesting history, but
Yeah. No, I
but
hear that. I'm
it's just like, what do I know? It's like I don't. I'd rather go out and learn something new about some other place than write about myself. It's the same reason I don't
right.
write memoirs. That kind of, at least not yet, I suppose.
Yeah, well, you're still young yet. Maybe I'm thinking of doing that too, because I don't know. You reach your 40s and you want to start remembering stuff before you forget. And I don't want to sound like an old man, but I mean, honestly, it's like things from 20 years ago start to fade.
Oh yeah.
But the tricky thing with Patsy too is like, well, what's the larger point? Is like she got out, So even though she's kind of a source of hometown pride, she's famous because she got out. She went to Nashville. She
Mm-hmm.
made it big somewhere else. So it's not like she was from New York City and she was stayed in New York City, or like these other bigger cities. Like you can go out there, make it there, and kind of stay, and you're kind of this part of this continuum. But these small towns, it's either get out or you're just gonna live this sort of quiet anonymous life, honestly.
She worked at a chicken factory, pulling
Yeah.
feathers and legs off birds. She was a soda jerk at the local pharmacy, and it was, yeah. I mean, it's interesting thinking about finding a way out. I don't get. I mean, obviously, there was a limitation to her ability to make it as a singer just in Winchester. And that goes for anybody. Yeah, unless you're living in Los Angeles or New York or something else, you're very limited. You know, if you want to perform for people, you're going to have to leave home. And so she did start even a sort of minor circuit around that, you know, that tri-state West Virginia, Maryland area. And then I guess at that point, you know, the Holy Grail was the Jimmy Dean Hour, which broadcast out of Washington, D.C., which was kind of a country and western town in the 50s at that point as well. So
yeah.
So I guess she knew that she had to leave in order to make it as a singer, but I don't think that she was inspired to sing out of a desire to leave, if that makes sense. Like some people grow up bored and are like, whoa, music can be my way out of here. And she may have had that, but she was like, you know, pretty, you know, she only, well, first of all, she only arrived in Winchester. She was born there, but she lived all around Virginia and only arrived in Winchester to live there again when she was about 16 years old. And so it wasn't like she became locally beloved, but she wasn't like a lifetime resident or anything like that.
Right.
But she started singing because she was good at it and because it was a way to support herself. And I guess, and support her family, who needed the money. Yeah, it's a weird thing, but it's not the story quite. It's not quite the same as, like, well, for example, I'm writing about the Creedence Clearwater Revival guys, which was, you know, a little bit later, and they were very much like suburban as opposed to small town people, and like the radio and black music on the radio in particular was a very big thing. And so there was a sense of, we got to get out of this place, and music is the way we can do it. With Patsy, it was more sort of like, I need to support my family, so I'm going to sing. And if I'm going to sing to support my family, I'm going to have to go other places to make that happen.
No, it's a very interesting story to see that her career was very short compared to a lot of country musicians. I mean, it's heartbreaking, but she was kind of really hitting her stride when she died, correct?
Yeah, she had been sort of, so her breakout hit was in 1957, Walking After Midnight. And then she had a couple years in the woods where she was like a famous person in the country and western world, but she didn't have like another big hit until basically 1961 when Crazy came, or no, 1961 was, oh my God, can you tell it's been a little while since I've been researching her discography? But, you know, she had basically like four big songs, the fourth of which came out right after she died, and that was She's Got You, that came out in 1963. I Fall to Pieces was the one that came in 1961, and Crazy was in 1962. And so those were massive songs, like, you know, what we would consider a crossover hit. And then she was dead in early 1963. She was 30 years old when she died.
Right.
And you figure that was 1963. I mean, a lot happened in music in the following years. She could have gone a lot of different ways, you know, and especially just in the country world, just in the, you know, her sort of like acolyte, Loretta Lynn, did incredibly powerful, path-breaking work just in the 5 or 6 years after that. So who's to say what would have happened to Patsy Cline afterward? Yeah. But yeah, she sort of died in mid-stride, as it were, and is kind of immortalized as this like forever young symbol of youthful innocence as a result of that.
Right, and I think you tweeted the other day she only recorded about 100 songs. Is that right?
Yeah, so the box set, the complete Patsy Cline, it was 4 discs that came out in the 90s and collected pretty much all of the recordings that she ever made, plus a few live recordings, and that has 102 tracks on it, couple of
Okay.
those are live songs that weren't officially released. 102 songs is not like a small body of work, and she was
That's
recording
true,
for a
yeah.
long time before. Yeah, she was recording a long time before the Walking After Midnight thing happened. What I think is amazing, if you go back and listen to that box set, is how diverse the style she took on. She had some real straight up honky tonkers, which are great. She kind of created what we now think of as the Nashville sound, which is that sort of like kind of easy listening style, like hi-fi, like, country music for the hi-fi with strings
Right.
and that kind of thing, and very clean musical separation.
Lush.
She recorded, a song like Strange, which is a beautiful song, but is kind of a Latin-y flavor, like kind of a pop song. I think the song that I tweeted is one of my favorite songs by her, which is called Yesterday, Today, and Forever, which is like, it's almost like a teeny bopper pop ballad. It's
Okay.
beautiful, but I don't think you would listen to it and think, oh, here's a country song. It has more in common with like the Hawaiian guitar, sort of phase that was going on culturally at that time, which is kind of
Yeah.
what made pedal steel, into the thing that was going. And there was a lot of like luau style, like the tiki bar kitschy thing that was going on. She had a toe dipped in that. She did a lot of stuff, and one of the things I learned when I was researching her was that her favorite music before country was big band jazz. So I think she would have. This is such a silly thing to say about, because I'm completely pulling it out of my ass. But she could have very well gone on to have a career of the kind that we associate with someone like Linda Ronstadt, who sort of started in a country milieu and then, went on to record with Nelson Riddle and went on to record songs in Spanish and went on to, do duets with Kermit the Frog and Aaron Neville. And like, it's like she had already shown by age 30 that she could adapt to kind of anything. And she had already shown that she was one of the most just kind of technically stunning voices that you could imagine. It's just an amazing. One of the most fun parts about writing this book was just being able to sort of spend a page or two here and there just describing her voice, which was just an amazing instrument, and there are so many wonderful country singers, but her, she was not a wonderful country singer. She was like an opera level talent in terms of her control of her breath and the way that she was able to modulate from one note to another and leap across a melody and sort of, when you listen to those 102 songs, there is not a trace of nerves. She's just in total control from the very earliest go of like what to do with that instrument. It's just astonishing. It's amazing, and it's wonderful that she is still listened to so much. At the same time, I feel like she's sort of weirdly underappreciated, because it's like the breadth of what she did isn't fully understood.
Well, and I think part of her gift is, as you say, maybe some hurts her a bit in that she could kind of transcend country into pop. So a lot of people might hear it and they're like, that's not a country song. And then you find out Crazy was written by Willie Nelson. You're like, what?
Yeah.
Willie Nelson's writing that song in the early 60s. So no,
when you listen to that song, which is the perfect example. Talk about the perfect marriage of two talents right there.
Yeah.
Because it was such a big deal in the late 70s when Willie recorded Stardust, and it was, here's like the outlaw's outlaw, like pot smoking king of Austin, Armadillo World Headquarters is recording Hoagie Carmichael, and that was considered this sort of like, what's he doing move. But then if you watch or if you listen to Crazy, and I'm a very amateur guitar player, but of course the fun of writing about country music is you get to sort of, some pretty easy tunes to learn how to play, but Crazy is not one of them. Crazy is the chord structure of that song is very odd, and is like,
Yeah.
You think like, how did this occur to somebody? I Fall to Pieces, marvelous song, incredible song. Even Walking After Midnight, all timer. Like this is not to say more complex equals better, but there are precedents for how to write a song like I Fall to Pieces and Crazy, or Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow. I can't think exactly of a precedent for how to write a song like Crazy, which moves from C to A7 to D minor to F sus7 and goes through. It's just like it moves all over the place, and that melody is nuts. I mean, that would be, you could, if you were paying attention, I say pretentiously, in 1961, I think you could foresee that the writer of that song would, of course, know how to play the Gershwins and Hoagie Carmichael and whoever else. Like, that song is just as complex as those. It's a Sinatra song in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and that Stardust album was huge. I mean, that wasn't just some vanity project that Willie did. I mean, a lot of people bought that album. But no, it's like the 3-chord myth when you first start playing guitar, and like even something as basic as maybe the Beatles or the Who, like it's not basic.
No.
What the hell are all these weird chords? And you hear someone's like, oh, well, John Lennon, he started out on banjo, so there's all these weird like open chords and shit, and you're just like, all right. I mean, it's just the complexity, and like you say, that's just the chord structure. We're not getting into the melody and instrumentation and all that, and how it comes together is just beautiful. But no, I mean, she's my favorite singer in country, certainly. I mean, some people, George Jones is kind of the default, but I put it on Patsy. Just an amazing voice. But if you got some time, you brought up Creedence. I did want to talk about. Can we talk about that book for a bit?
We can. Yeah.
Okay.
I should tell you too. I probably got about. I'm having a blast. I could talk all day, but I probably have about 10 minutes.
Okay.
And just available to me right now before I need to get back.
Sure.
To some other things.
Well,
but, yeah,
I know
absolutely. We can talk about CCR.
This is a work in progress, so maybe talk about how it started and kind of where you're at with it.
So, well, first of all, where are you at is an extremely rude question to ask anybody who's writing a book, Colin. So I reject the premise. No, so Homeplace came out in the summer of 2018, and as you can tell, it's kind of like, it's a little neither fish nor fowl. It's like it's written in my voice, but it's not really a memoir. It's kind of a travel book, but it has a lot of history in it. It's a music book, but it's not like a biography of a famous musician or anything like that. So I knew I would love to write a second book, and hopefully a few others down past that. So, but I was, once I sort of had that project wrapped up, I started thinking about what would be, like, where do you go? I honestly thought, should I write another book about a town? Like, should I be the guy who writes about towns? That fell by the wayside pretty quickly, because no, I do not want to be the guy who writes about, I don't want to be like the James Michener of like post-war post-war Americana or whatever. Sure. But although maybe I'll do one down the road, I did spend some time in the eastern shore of Maryland researching the town of Cambridge, which has a fascinating African American history, especially during let's not say African American, let's say Black, fascinating Black history during the Civil Rights Movement. And so there was a time briefly when I thought that might be something cool to do. I knew I didn't want to write about myself. That just didn't, the sort of, the fact that Homeplace was written from my point of view was kind of a creative decision to kind of bring some cohesion to all these different stories. I don't think that you learn a lot about me from that book necessarily, about my personal life or anything like that, but telling it all from my point of view was like a good way to kind of make them all seem more directly related than they might be otherwise. But so in conversations with other people, I was thinking, okay, well, maybe like a biography of a musician. And, I love so many musicians, but then you have to think of like, okay, who actually could, who's worth a biography? Because you can love a musician without necessarily wanting to read 300 pages about them, or without their life necessitating that. And then also, just frankly, commercially, I want to write a book that people read. No offense to academics or anything like that, but I'm not writing for university presses, or I am writing sort of trade narrative nonfiction here. And so it has to be for example, I would have loved to have written a biography of, God, I don't know, Todd Rundgren, or early jazz musicians that I really love, or another country person. But I just you do have to think a little bit in terms of the market. And then the Creedence thing came up, and was like, oh, that's a good idea, because everybody likes Creedence. But then I was like, I initially kind of balked at it, because I was like, well, I don't know if I want to be the 50 millionth person to write like a Woodstock era rock and roll book. And so what really got me interested in them and convinced me that they were a book project was when I learned that even though their height of fame was relatively short, lasting from 1968 to 72, and really from like 1969 through 1970,
right?
They had actually been around since the late 50s, or they had been playing together since the late 50s, and they got together when they were 13 years old. And obviously there are two brothers, Tom and John Fogerty, in that band who clearly knew each other even longer than that. So when I started thinking, okay, you could and they were recording, as a what was, before the term garage band had even been coined. They were a recording group for different sort of local labels in the San Francisco Bay Area since, from like 1961. They recorded as like the backing group for a doo-wop singer. They recorded a couple songs under different band names. They were Tommy Fogerty and the Blue Velvets. They were the Visions for a little while. They were the Gollywogs for a bit. And then it wasn't until like 10 years after their first, middle school practice together that they became Creedence, and then became famous. And so once I sort of realized you could tell a story of not just a famous band that played Woodstock and overlapped with the Vietnam War and all that other stuff, but you could write a story of four guys who came of age together and played music throughout the entire 1960s, then I thought, well, that's a book. You know what I mean? Like that, to think, for a band to get together when doo-wop was big, and to break up when like Led Zeppelin was the biggest band on earth, like that's a journey. You know what I mean? Like it's that's a different thing altogether. Especially because the 60s, when we think of that era, Patsy Cline is a perfect example. Most of her famous songs were recorded and released during the 60s. 61, 62, 63. And when we think of the 60s now, we tend to think of like Haight-Ashbury and psychedelia, or whatever your sort of shorthand, garage rock, whatever you go to when you think of that time period. But there was it took a while. It took a while for everybody to lose their innocence over that time, and Creedence was making music throughout that whole period. So that's where I'm in the middle of right now. I've been researching it, 2.5 years now. The writing is like, I'm into it, certainly, but I've it's like I've got the momentum building behind me. I'll probably be writing it for another 6 months to a year, I would say.
Okay.
Which, it's honestly, I'm the kind of person, and the kind of writing I have the kind of writing I do, I sort of have to build up an immense amount of research before I can kind of like feel confident enough to just sit down and not just peck out, one word after. And you need to get some.
I hear that.
You need to feel like you're floating along, and I can't float unless I have like the material at hand to do that. So I tend to do a lot more reading than writing, honestly, with these projects. The writing sort of comes at the tail end almost.
Now, have you been able to talk to some of the members of the band? I think they're all around except Tommy, right?
Yeah, Tom died in 1990, and John Fogerty keeps a pretty tight, close-knit circle. So I have attempted many times through different means to reach out to him. He is, to my knowledge, or at least the people close to him, are aware that I'm writing the book, because I've had the deal to write the book since May of 2019.
Okay.
But I've not gotten any feedback that he's interested in being interviewed. The lucky thing is that he's been interviewed for the last 50 years and many, many times, and he's written his own autobiography. So his sort of version of events are definitely well established. Clearly, I would leap at the chance to talk with him, but I don't think my speaking with him is necessary in order to get his sort of version of events. I have been and am in very close ongoing contact with Stu Cook and Doug Clifford, the bass player and drummer for the band. So I'm in the middle of doing, I basically have standing weekly phone interviews with both of them that,
oh, cool.
For about an hour or so each, because they've been interviewed a lot over the years too, but certainly not to this level of detail. And while I obviously think that John Fogerty is a genius and certainly the primary driving creative force of that band, they were very much a band, and the music they made was made by four people, and the experience that they had was experienced by four people. So I'm glad that I'm going to be able to sort of bring a new level of the other guy's perspective that I don't think has been brought to previous treatments of this story before.
Yeah, that's great. And now I understand that about trying to get kind of the big fish with John, because if you want to really extract what you need to get out of him, you probably need like 40 hours of interviews to kind of go, almost like track by track or album by album or something. And
right.
Even if you got to talk to him for an hour or two, what are you going to learn that you haven't?
Well, if I ever spoke to him, and it, whether it was for 40 hours or an hour or half an hour, I probably wouldn't ask him about the songs, because he's on the record about the songs. I'd probably ask him about his relationship to his dad. I'd probably ask him about about how he grew up. He's the other thing, that convinced me that this was worthy of a book was that, he is an incredible character. And I don't mean like in the sense of a goofball, or like he's like life of the party. It's kind of the opposite. He was, he's a very self-serious, driven young man from a very young age. And also, as I say, I mean, I don't use this word lightly, a complete genius savant at multiple aspects of music making. Like, I think he's an incredibly underrated guitar player, an incredible songwriter, a remarkable singer. And he also did all of he was the producer of those tracks. And if you go back, we all know those songs. Everybody knows those songs. But I think if you go back and you listen to them, I don't want to say critically, but just like if you throw it on a stereo that you haven't heard those songs on for a while, you will notice something about them that you didn't notice before. And I can't tell you what it'll be, but there's just like those productions are incredible, and the arrangements of them, the mixing of them, just the small, really music nerd part of it is just astounding. And he did all of it. They broke up when he was 26 years old, and but at the same time, he was, I think he's a difficult guy. I mean, he's been in and out of lawsuits with his bandmates and his brother ever since they broke up. And, I've spoken to a lot of people outside the band who knew them, and you don't hear a lot of stories about like the great night I had with John Fogerty. You know what I mean? And it's like, and I don't say that to knock him, like so many people aren't like, I don't know if you ever read Springsteen's autobiography, but it was really about that. It was him sort of looking back at his life and wondering like, why wasn't I having more fun all that time? It's like he was doing an immense amount of work and had an immense amount of pressure on himself. And I think their two stories are very similar. So, when I say that John is a great character, I mean it. He's like a complex enough person to build a book around, because it's like, I find it amazing anytime you can talk about one of these people who just entertained so many people without ever really seeming entertained themselves. That's fascinating to me. So that's what I'm trying to uncover a little bit here with that story.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. No, I know he's a pretty intense dude, and maybe he missed out on a lot of the parties and stuff, but he's also still around. So
I think he's honestly, from what I can tell, I think he's probably happier now than he's ever been. He's playing music a lot. He's playing with his kids. He's playing, there were many years after the band broke up when he did not play Creedence songs, and he now seems to have come around on that fully and loves to be in front of audiences. And I mean it sincerely. God bless him. He deserves to be happy. We all do, but him especially. He has brought an incredible amount of enjoyment. And he has improved a lot of people's lives. And I don't say that lightly either. Like, there's going to be some talk about Vietnam in this book, of course. And the people who heard that music in Vietnam feel strongly in many cases that it saved their lives, or that it sort of helped them through. So I mean it when I say, like, this is a man who deserves joy in his life, and he's earned it. And so if he has found some peace and some comfort, I hope that is the case, and I wish him well. I wish he'd talk to me, but that's not up to me. So
well, it could maybe happen. And now if he's sitting at home all the time,
I know when a couple months, the last time I talked to him, I think it was in like February, and they told me he was too busy. And then after a couple months ago, I was like, I don't think anyone's too busy to get on.
No,
but it's fine. I'm honestly not busting his chops. And I do really believe that, he's been very generous to interviewers in the past. I think he has a sort of set, like a lot of people that I've interviewed, has a sort of set number of answers that he gives to some of these questions as well.
Sure.
So,
I've been writing about Johnny Cash for a while, and I've not been able to contact anyone in the family.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I know a historian of the family who's given me some real good dirt on them that I can't talk about because it's a family secret. But I'm like, well, that's how you get the really juicy gossip.
Of course.
Someone that knows someone. But well, that sounds like a really interesting book. So you think you might be done at like early next year?
I think we're aiming, I think this book will come out probably in 2022. I couldn't tell you anything more specific than that,
Sure.
But I'm hoping if I get it done within a year of now, that's late 2021. And then it usually takes about 8 to 10 months for the whole, pre-production and everything from about the time you turn in a manuscript with a major house like that to the time when it's actually on stores takes 8 to 10 months or so. So I'm hoping 2022, and hopefully by then bookstores are open and I'll be talking to people in person about this great music.
Yeah, I hope the plague is over by then. You can do a proper tour. Is it the same publisher?
No, this time I'm working with Hachette Publishers.
Okay.
Specifically, one of their editors who works with more like tried and true music books, sort of band biographies. So it's had a wonderful experience with Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, who put out Homeplace. But I think this project makes more sense for this particular publisher. So it's the perfect home for it. Really excited.
Well, that sounds great. I look forward to reading that, and you should definitely come down to Richmond once that's
I know.
out. I'm sure.
I look forward to it. We can tour some old Civil War stuff. Let's.
Yeah, there's no shortage of that.
Yeah, I know. We can spray paint it or whatever people are doing these days. Very exciting.
Yeah, you got to check out the monuments. Or maybe by then Lee will be gone. He's the only one left on Monument Avenue. So
good. All right. Well, I'll bring my rope and TNT, and we'll get down to business, Colin.
Well, hijack a bulldozer.
Yeah, exactly. Happen. And then this podcast will be used in a deposition at some point. So see you on the other side when we have to go underground.
All right. Well, John, this has been really fun, and good luck with your son, and that's a couple weeks away, right? So
theoretically, we'll see how it goes.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll let you know when this is up. And yeah, just good luck with everything, man. It was great talking to you.
Thank you so much, Colin. This was a real honor.
All right, that was my talk with John Lingan. I hope you enjoyed that. Check out his book, Homeplace, A Southern Town, A Country Legend in the Last Days of a Mountaintop Honky Tonk. So check that out, and also look for his book on Creedence. I'm not sure exactly what it's going to be called, but hopefully that should be out next year, or maybe early 2022. This has been American Rambler. I am your host, Colin Woodward. You can check out my book, Marching Masters, Slavery, Race, and the Confederate Army During the Civil War, available through University of Virginia Press. It's been kind of slow going with the sales, but you can still get a signed copy. Sometimes I say $35, sometimes I say $30, but for this week, if you hear this and you want one, I will get it to you for $30. So contact me on the podcast page, which no one ever does. Get me on Twitter. That's the best way. Colin E. Woodward. That is my Twitter handle. You can direct message me, and I will hook you up with a new copy of my book. And if you want it signed, I will do that for you. In the meantime, trying to get through this rain patch. We had some really nice October days last week, but I swear to God, it's like every other day or third day, my allergies kick in, and a nice day is just pretty much ruined by my allergies. So I haven't been sneezing much this weekend, but it's just been raining. I guess we're getting the remnants of that last hurricane or tropical storm, whatever it was, that hit Louisiana, went right up the same path as Laura, and Lake Charles getting slammed again, and people that had hardly recovered from the last storm were wiped out again or lost power. Even the people up in Alexandria, it was pretty bad, and so they got it again. And it's scary to think that people still deny the climate change. They ran out of names for the hurricanes this year, so they went into the Greek alphabet, and this was the Delta storm. So, maybe you should vote for the people that believe in science and believe in climate change, because we are seeing the evidence of it everywhere. The horrible hurricane season, the wildfires in California. So the evidence is out there, but I know a lot of people are still not going to believe it. But I hope, I'll say hope, I don't want to predict, I'm hoping a change is coming soon. We've got a couple weeks left in this election cycle, which I can't wait to be over, and all the signs being down, and we can move on, hopefully, into a more progressive era, and not having President COVID Mick Bone Spurs being in charge, lying about everything under the sun. But don't want to get into that. Y'all know how I feel about Trump. So go Joe. I have voted, and hope you will too, for the good guys. All right, I will be talking with you soon. Take care. Bye.